Now, the Naassenes have a particular reputation in early Christian studies. They have, in the history of interpretation, been accused of being a homosexual group, a group practicing sodomy, as it was put in a former generation, or in modern terms, a group involved in homosexual sex acts. That is, acts between men, and perhaps between women and women, although there has been some doubt raised as to whether there were women in the Nicene Christian group. Today, I'd like to explore whence this interpretation derives and whether it is a reasonable historical interpretation given what we know. As many of you know, our only access to Nicene material is through the pen of the refutator, that is, the author of the Refutation of All Heresies, who paraphrases parts of the Nicene discourse. And as he's paraphrasing, not too far into the discourse, he comes to the Nicene interpretation of Romans 1:24 to 27. Now, I'm not going to read this entire passage in Romans. I'll just take a snippet of it from the New Revised Standard Version. In context, this has been used to browbeat homosexuals. So this is a surprising text to pick from when we are supposedly meeting a group in support of homosexual sex acts. At any rate, in the New Revised Standard Version, we read that God gave up people who didn't recognize his true nature and glory to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way, also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men. Now, when the Nicene preacher gets to this verse, he understands it in a different way. Obviously, he is speaking in the original Greek, and it's the original Greek which interests him because this word translated shame, askemasuni, can be understood in another way, and that is the way of formlessness. So when I translated this section of the Nicene discourse, I translated it in a Nicene way, as men with men performed the work of formlessness. A schema in Greek is a form or a figure. So when you put the alpha privative out in front, it becomes an a schema and a non-shape, a non-form. And askemasuni is formlessness or non-figured nature. So this is a possible way of reading the text. It's a highly etymological reading because askemasuni normally means something like disgrace, or as the NRSV puts it, shameless acts. According to the Nicene preacher, as I call him, formlessness means the primal and blessed being. He is formless and the cause of all forms for entities that are formed. This is from my translation of the Refutation of All Heresies 5.7.18. Now, this is an important text because the way that the Nicene author thought of this verse is he didn't think of it as a condemnation of same-sex sexual activity. He thought of it as a case where people were engaged in acts of formlessness in imitation of the formless deity. And to understand exactly what he meant, we need to grasp just a little bit of Nicene theology. Nicene theology, in my view, is basically binitarian. You have a human and a child of the human. The human and the child of the human are one consubstantial deity, but they are at least two persons, as we might say in later Trinitarian language. The Father deity is also called the formless intellect. The Son or the child is called characterized, and he is the characterized human. So the ultimate deity, in other words, has no form. But the second tier or born form of deity is characterized and has a form, and that form is the form of humanity, whence comes individual souls. So when the Nicene author is referring to the formless being or formlessness as indicating the formless and blessed being, he's referring to that upper deity, the high deity, who is often called the Father deity. But let me pause my interpretation of Nazi thought here and turn to several other interpretations which have been put forward and which you should know about. The first I'll discuss is quite recent from Jonathan Kahana Bloom, Wrestling with Archons, page 138. He argues that, quote, the Naassenes reconfigured this text, referring here to Romans 1:20 to 27, to mean that performing same sex acts is an ineffable mystery of blessed pleasure that attains salvation, unquote. So, in his view, the Naassenes are trying to invent a kind of what he calls unnatural theology. They're performing inverse exegesis in order to deliberately change the meaning of a text, essentially to support a kind of unconventional morality. In this case, a morality which involves sex between men. In part, this theory goes back to something that we find in an earlier book by Randy Connor called Blossom of Bone. And in this book, Connor argues that the Naassenes viewed themselves as mystics and that these mystics could have a different view or a different application of morality for themselves than was normative for other people. And in this case, Randy Connor thinks that the Naassenes did engage in acts where men with men literally had sex with each other. And he even refers to the Nicene mystery of fellatio. Perhaps the boldest interpretation comes from Jacques Le Carrière, who wrote a book in French and it's been translated into English as The Gnostics. Le Carrière believed that the Naassenes not only engaged in intercourse with each other, men with men, he believed that the Naassenes performed anal intercourse, specifically after the example of Nas, who is the serpent in the Garden of Eden, who engaged in a primal act of anal intercourse, apparently with Adam. Now, Nas, as the serpent, is a phallic symbol in the Garden of Eden and set an example for Naassenes who then engaged in anal intercourse with each other. And in the language of a former generation, Carrière speaks of Naasene sodomy, done in the name of the serpent as a ritual repetition of his first act. And it's Le Carrière who suggests that Naassenes also engaged in fellatio. Now, although I don't entirely exclude such interpretations as possible, I don't consider them plausible. And the reason being that the Nicene preacher was a highly allegorical interpreter, and it's important to understand him on the level of allegory. That is, when he talks about men and men, he's not literally talking about male human bodies, he's talking about minds. And he makes this clear in the context of his argument. And as a precedent for this kind of allegorical interpretation, I'll just point you to this text of Philo in the questions on Genesis, who, in this context, is interpreting the passage in which the men leave Noah's ark. And interpreting this passage, Philo says, quote, "Man should join with man, that is, the sovereign mind, like a father should join with its particular thoughts, as with its sons, but not join any of the female sex, that is, with what belongs to sense," unquote. And it's Philo's consistent interpretation that femaleness represents sense perception and maleness represents the mind. And therefore, when he talks about transcending the female, he's talking about the mind transcending sense perception. This whole idea of going beyond the female or femaleness becomes very popular in Christian ascetic texts, Christian Gnostic texts, if you will. And again, it's based on a kind of symbolism in which the female is configured as something bodily or corporeal or passionate, and the male is considered something noetic or purely mental and intellectual. And this was an ascetic ideal to transcend what was bodily and corporeal and passionate in order to become entirely calm without passions and focused on the realities of the mind and intellect alone. And I think this is similar to where the Nicene author is going. Men with men represent spiritual persons who are or who have separated themselves from bodies and bodily thoughts, who engage in spiritual interaction apart from bodies, apart from the flesh. And sex is the best symbol of talking about this intense spiritual interaction. And this intense spiritual interaction is called the mystery of blessed pleasure by the Nicene preacher. But in my view, he was not speaking of physical sexual pleasure, and neither was Philo. In fact, Philo has probably some of the worst rants against what he considered to be homoerotic behavior and homoerotic persons in antiquity. He would have never approved of homoerotic behavior or attitudes. Where I agree with these other interpreters is that the Nicene preacher was engaged in inverse exegesis. That's very clear. I think it's undeniable that he knew that his interpretation of Romans 1:27 was not something that was common or accepted among Christians in general. At the same time, his inverse exegesis wasn't an attempt to overturn the text or to support an activity which he considered unnatural or which the general society considered unnatural. No, I think that he was trying to lead his particular audience up into what we might call spiritual sex, that intense engagement between spirits or minds. And this was something good. So instead of being a disgrace when men with men commit the deed of formlessness, this acting out of formlessness is an imitation of God. It's not a disgrace. There's nothing shameful about it. And the due reward that they receive is something good. This, to the Nicene preacher, is what the text really means. And it is still true today that such an interpretation can be liberating for many people reading this biblical text today. Thank you so much to all of you for coming along and watching this short video presentation. For those of you who are interested in this topic and want to check out my larger argument, please see my book, The Naassenes: Exploring an Early Christian Identity. This book is quickly forthcoming from Routledge, and you can already get a deal on it online. Thank you again to everybody for your support. Please leave a like and a comment and consider supporting me on Patreon. All of you, take care.